Karoline Leavitt vs. Whoopi Goldberg. Historic clash on The View. Whoopi Goldberg was confident that this episode would follow the usual script. Another conservative guest, another easy win. But Karoline Leavitt was not one to be backed into a corner. Stay tuned for the ending of this story, and don't forget to subscribe and like so you don't miss out on new stories. Morning in the studio. The View. It began as usual. Lighting checked, cameras set up, makeup artists putting the finishing touches on. The producer's room was a hive of activity, drafting the final script, refining lines, making final adjustments before air. No one expected the day to spiral out of control. Whoopi Goldberg sat in the dressing room, holding a cup of coffee. She lazily glanced at the producer's notes, but she read them mostly out of inertia. None of this was necessary. She knew her role, the experience honed over the years. When someone with conservative views came into the studio, the pattern was always the same: start with a gentle push, ask a provocative question, force the interlocutor to defend himself, and then overwhelm with authority, audience laughter, and sharp remarks. The guest left confused, the audience rejoiced. Another conservative. Another easy win. But today something different awaited her. Karoline Leavitt sat in the green room, her finger casually scrolling through her phone's news feed. Messages from friends and colleagues came in one after another. They will attack. Be prepared. They want you to look stupid. Don't let them push you into a corner. She smiled. As if she didn't know. This wasn't the first time Karoline had seen the View treats guests who dared to disagree with their line. They invited conservatives only to make them look ridiculous or absurd. Every word was cut off, every argument was ridiculed, and the audience, prepared in advance to applaud the right moments, only increased the effect. But today everything will be different. She looked up at the screen, where the pre-show discussion was taking place. They were talking about politics, the media, the dangers of misinformation. Karoline grinned. She knew what this was going to be about. It would boil down to accusations that conservative media was spreading lies. She adjusted the microphone attached to her jacket, took a sip of water, and took a deep breath. This battle hadn't even begun yet, and she already knew how to win it. The studio lights flashed, the familiar introductory music began. The hosts took their places, the audience took their places. Everything went as usual. Whoopi walked into the frame with a familiar smile, but there was a hidden wit in her eyes. She had seen dozens of such guests, and to her, Karoline Leavitt was just another figure in a familiar game. Welcome to The View, she said. We have a very interesting guest today. The young star of conservative media, Karoline Leavitt. Applause. Karoline looked up, meeting Whoopi's gaze. There was something different about that look. She didn't look intimidated. She looked ready. The room froze in anticipation. The cameras locked on the hosts. The producers gave the signal to go on air. Everything was going according to a long-established script. Whoopi Goldberg took the center stage, her co-hosts in a semicircle around the table. The atmosphere seemed familiar, almost relaxed, but tension was already in the air. Welcome to The View, Whoopi said, her voice sounding confident, as if this was just another routine episode of the show. Today we have a special guest, young conservative media star Karoline Leavitt. The applause was loud but insincere. The audience, prepared in advance, knew who they were supposed to support. Karoline looked up, her gaze calm, even a little curious. She didn't look scared or worried, like many of the previous guests. That was her strength. She didn't give them the opportunity to see her as a victim. Karoline, thank you for coming, Whoopi began, folding her hands on the table. But let's be honest. There's a lot of misinformation being spread by conservative media right now. How do you explain that? Silence. It was a tried and tested move to immediately put the guest on the defensive. To make them justify themselves. Usually after such an attack, the guests would start nervously analyzing the accusation, trying to explain something, losing the thread of the conversation. At that moment, Whoopi could interrupt them, insert a sarcastic comment, and make the audience laugh. But Karoline remained silent. She let the pause hang in the air a little longer than was comfortable. Someone in the audience stopped clapping mid-movement. The presenters looked at each other. And then, with a slight smile, Karoline replied, "Interesting question. But I think the more important question is who decides what is considered disinformation." The hall froze. Whoopi wasn't used to such responses. Usually, her guests would immediately rush into excuses, thus confirming her main goal to show that they felt guilty. But Karoline didn't feel guilty. Disinformation is lies, Karoline. It's things that mislead people. And your camp is doing it more than anyone else. Again, she expected Karoline to start arguing, to prove the opposite, to lose the thread of the conversation. But she was in no hurry. She looked at Whoopi carefully, slightly bowing her head, as if considering her words. "Really? But your camp often makes mistakes too. Or are we now simply ignoring all the times your show has spread unverified information?" This time the audience did not laugh. Some people in the audience turned their heads, some raised their eyebrows. Whoopi pursed her lips. "Oh, please, we check all the information. We are journalists, not propagandists." "Journalism?" Karoline asked again with a slight smile. "When was the last time you invited a conservative onto your show and let him finish at least one thought without interrupting?" The hall froze again. This time, even the co-hosts began to fidget nervously in their chairs. Whoopi pretended not to notice how her colleagues had tensed up, trying to get the conversation back on track. "Look, Karoline, you're sitting here on our show, live on air. Isn't that proof that we give a platform to different opinions?" Karoline nodded slowly. "Sure. You give a platform. But is it a platform for debate? Or is it a platform for conservatives to be put in a position of justification?" At this moment, for the first time during the entire show, someone in the audience stopped applauding. Whoopi felt the situation spiraling out of control. She leaned forward sharply, as if trying to physically regain control. "Oh, let's not pretend that your side is poor victims. Conservatives own the biggest TV channels, they flood social media, they run political parties. Where is this notorious censorship that you love to talk about?" She made a wide gesture with her hands, as if to show that, look, there was a person sitting in front of her who was not being prevented from speaking. Karoline leaned forward, her smile growing a little wider. "Of course we can talk. But how many times after such interviews did your guests not receive any more invitations?" Whoopi opened her mouth, but didn't immediately find what to say. "Well, I see you didn't come for a discussion, but for an attack." She tried to steer the conversation back to normal. But it was already too late. Karoline paused again. She let Whoopi feel her own words. "I came for a discussion. But you are used to your guests being afraid to speak. I am not afraid." A tense silence fell. The co-hosts exchanged nervous glances. The producers began to fuss backstage. They saw that something was wrong. The audience did not laugh. The audience did not applaud. Hall listened. And it was at that moment that Whoopi realized she was no longer in control of the situation. The silence in the studio was becoming more and more noticeable. The room that usually exploded with applause after every line from Whoopi Goldberg was now silent. The audience had grown accustomed to conservative guests being cornered, made to look ridiculous or incompetent. But today, something was wrong. Karoline Leavitt didn't defend herself, didn't make excuses, didn't lose the thread of the conversation. She simply answered calmly, confidently, with a smile that infuriated her opponents more than any attack. Whoopi felt it. She was used to a different scenario. She was used to controlling the conversation, dictating the tone, forcing her opponents to justify themselves. But now, sitting in front of her, was a girl who wasn't even trying to play by her rules. Whoopi pressed her lips together, glanced quickly at the producers behind the camera, then back at Karoline. "Oh, please, no more of these games." Her voice became a little sharper than at the beginning of the conversation. Conservatives constantly shout about censorship, but at the same time they occupy key positions, own the media, shape policy. Where is this notorious injustice that you speak of? She spread her arms, casting a quick glance at the audience. Some of them applauded, but not as confidently as before. Karoline paused again. She knew Whoopi was trying to regain control, but she knew the calmer she was, the more it would irritate the host. I wasn't talking about injustice. I was talking about fairness. Whoopi tensed. Okay, let's figure this out. She leaned forward sharply, her tone becoming more aggressive. Your side is constantly playing the victim, claiming that you are not being heard. But here you are, sitting in front of millions of viewers. Who is drowning you out? Karoline tilted her head slightly. Did someone interrupt me? The hall froze for a moment. No? Then wait another minute, it will definitely happen now. Whoopi narrowed her eyes. She realized that Karoline had made a clever move. Now every time she was interrupted, the audience would see it not as a normal conversation, but as proof of her words. The presenter bit her lip. So now you're saying we're not letting you speak? No, I say that you will allow me to speak exactly until my words begin to irritate you. At this point, one of the co-hosts quickly tried to intervene. Okay, let's change the topic, otherwise we're getting stuck here. But Whoopi didn't listen to her. Karoline looked straight at her. You don't want to change the subject, Whoopi. You need me to admit that you're right. But I'm afraid I won't. It was a blow. The hall held its breath. Even the producers backstage began whispering nervously to each other. They could see Whoopi was losing control. And she understood it too. So that's what it is. Whoopi's voice became even sharper. You want to portray yourself as a victim. You are not oppressed, you are not censored, you are just playing to the crowd. Karoline smiled. I'm just answering your questions, Whoopi. But you are avoiding the truth. Whose truth? Yours? There was another pause. Whoopi probably expected the audience to burst into laughter at this point, and for her co-host to pick up on it and start to finish Karoline off. But no one laughed. Because everyone saw Whoopi loses. Let's be honest, Karoline finally said. You invited me here not for a discussion, but for a performance. You expected me to start making excuses, and you would insert sarcastic comments, causing laughter in the audience. She paused, letting her words sink in. But your scenario didn't work. This moment was decisive. For the first time in years, Whoopi Goldberg felt like she was losing control. You could see it in her eyes, in the way her fingers began to tap nervously on the table, in the way she glanced toward the directors as if waiting for some kind of signal from them. But no one could save her. Karoline looked back into the room and then, bowing her head slightly, said, You say conservatives are playing the victim. But honestly, Whoopi, who looks like they can handle a debate these days. These words came like a bolt from the blue. And then something happened that no one expected. The audience, which had been prepared to support Whoopi, suddenly burst into applause. Not all of them, of course, but a significant part. The producers froze. The co-hosts remained silent. Whoopi Goldberg, the woman who had dominated the conversation for years, dictated the rules, and left her guests no chance, realized in that moment. She lost. Whoopi Goldberg felt something boiling inside her. She knew she was losing control, but she couldn't let that happen. This was her show. She called the shots. She asked questions, and the guests made excuses. They got confused, nervous, lost the thread of the conversation. It was a well-honed mechanism. But now everything was different. Karoline Leavitt didn't make excuses. She didn't falter, she didn't get overwhelmed by the attacks, she didn't try to please the audience. She just sat there, answered questions, and didn't let Whoopi paint her into a corner. The audience felt it. Some viewers, who had recently applauded every phrase of the presenter, were now silent. A few people even risked clapping after Karoline's last answer. This was unacceptable. Whoopi leaned forward sharply. Are you saying that I am driving you into a corner? Her voice sounded a little louder than usual. Karoline looked at her without changing her expression. What I mean is that you are not used to someone not being afraid of your questions. A barely noticeable whisper passed through the hall. The producers backstage began to exchange glances. Whoopi tensed. Listen, she paused, as if choosing her words. I have conducted hundreds of interviews. And I always let the guests speak. We have honest discussions. But your side, they do everything to portray themselves as victims. That is their main tactic. Karoline nodded. I wonder. When was the last time a conservative guest was on this show and walked away feeling like he'd been treated fairly? Whoopi rolled her eyes. Oh, please. We invite everyone. We are not biased. Karoline leaned forward slightly. Unbiased? How do you explain that every invitation from a conservative ends in an attack? Why do you throw accusations instead of questions? Why are all our words presented as if we have to justify them? Silence. Whoopi felt her breath catch. She was used to such interviews being a show. Everything was calculated. The guest could be interrupted, laughed at, pressured. But now everything was not going according to script. She glanced at her co-hosts, hoping someone would intervene. But they sat in tense silence. They, too, sensed that something unexpected was happening. You are sitting here in front of millions of viewers. Isn't that proof that we are giving you a voice? Whoopi asked, trying to regain the initiative. Karoline smiled. I'm sitting here. But how many times have conservatives been invited back after interviews like this? How many times have their opinions not been made the butt of ridicule? Whoopi opened her mouth, but didn't immediately find what to say. The audience froze. It was the moment of truth. Whoopi Goldberg no longer controlled the conversation. She tried, but every time she lunged, Karoline didn't defend herself. She simply responded, and the responses were so logical that they didn't elicit the usual wave of laughter or applause from the audience. It was infuriating. Whoopi exhaled sharply, trying to hide her irritation. Oh, come on! Let's stop pretending that conservatives are poor victims. Your views are not an oppressed ideology. Karoline folded her hands calmly on the table. I didn't say I was depressed. I said you weren't ready for an honest conversation. These words sounded like a blow to the heart. Whoopi felt her neck tense, her fingers tapping on the table. She had never felt so helpless in her own studio. She turned to the audience, expecting the usual support. But the hall was silent. Someone clapped, but it was more a gesture of respect for Karoline's composure than a sign of support for the presenter. This was the last straw. Whoopi jerked back, then leaned forward and ripped the microphone off her body. You know what? She said, her voice trembling with anger. Karoline didn't answer. She just looked at her. Whoopi glanced around the audience again, then stood up abruptly from her seat. I'm not going to waste my time on this circus. She turned and walked off the stage. Silence reigned in the hall. Everyone looked after her. The cameras continued to roll. The presenters froze, not knowing what to do. And at that moment, Karoline calmly looked into the lens and said, Well, I think that speaks for itself. The hall exploded with applause. When Whoopi Goldberg turned and walked out of the studio, the silence in the room was deafening. Even the cameras seemed to freeze for a moment, capturing the unexpected moment. The co-hosts sat in shock, the producers backstage chatted feverishly, and the audience didn't know how to react. Karoline Leavitt watched calmly. She didn't smirk, she didn't make sarcastic remarks, she didn't make any triumphant gestures. She just sat there, her back straight, a slight, almost weightless smile on her lips. And then, as if nothing special had happened, she slowly turned to the cameras and said, Well, I think that speaks for itself. These words sounded like the final chord. The audience burst into applause. Not everyone, of course. Some of the audience was still trying to process what had just happened. Those who were used to seeing Whoopi as the undisputed leader of the View were shocked by her exit. Others, those who had long seen through the show's bias, clapped with genuine delight. The cameras continued to roll, but no one in the studio knew what to do next. The hosts looked at each other in confusion, hoping that someone would take matters into their own hands. The producers, who were backstage, were running around in a panic. What now? Someone's voice came through the director's headphones. Break for commercial. Urgent. The signal was given, the screen switched to advertising. But it was too late. The clip of Whoopi Goldberg leaving went viral faster than anyone expected. While the show's producers were deciding how to handle the situation, the video was already on Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, and dozens of news sites. Headlines flooded social media. Whoopi Goldberg couldn't handle the debate and ran off the stage. Karoline Leavitt won the battle on The View. When the usual scenario didn't work, people argued in the comments under the videos, but most agreed on one thing. Usually it's the conservatives who leave, but now it's the other way around. She just couldn't stand an honest conversation. That's all. So who here really can't debate? A few hours later, the hashtag Whoopi walks off found itself in global trends. Producers The View tried to soften the situation. 2 hours after the incident, the show released a statement. Today's episode was a little more tense than usual. We always strive for open discussion and diversity of opinion, but sometimes conversations go further than planned. But no one believed this version. By the time the official statement was released, millions of people had already seen the video of Whoopi's passing. And they didn't need an explanation, they saw what happened. The next day, Whoopi Goldberg did not appear on air. The official reason is planned vacation. But viewers knew that she had simply been removed until the scandal died down. While liberal media tried to minimize the damage, conservative platforms threw a real party. Fox News, The Daily Wire, Newsmax, and other outlets played the moment over and over again. "This was the greatest moment in The View history," said one of the Fox News hosts. They were used to humiliating guests, but when faced with a worthy response, they simply ran away. The show's former hosts also couldn't resist commenting. "This is what happens when you lose control of the narrative. They are used to dominating, but one day it all falls apart," wrote one of the former presenters The View via Twitter. But the most devastating blow was the reaction of Karoline Leavitt herself. She didn't record long video messages. She didn't give gloating interviews. She simply posted one single tweet. "I thought this was a debate." The tweet instantly gained millions of likes. People commented on it non-stop. "That's how to destroy all propaganda with one sentence. Simply legendary. So what's The View going to say now? Oh yeah, nothing." The scandal did not die down. Every day new memes, analyses, and discussions appeared. A few days after the incident, the show's sponsors began to get nervous. The big brands that had financed The View wondered, should they support a show that is suffering a reputational collapse? ABC was forced to act. A week after Whoopi left the studio, the show released another statement. "We always advocate for open and honest debate. We recognize the importance of balance of opinions and strive to ensure that our future guests feel comfortable." But no one bought these words. The show's ratings plummeted. Many viewers who had previously supported Whoopi now felt cheated. And then came the final blow. ABC announced that Whoopi taking a break. But everyone understood that this was not just a break. That was the end. This day changed the rules of the game. The View lost some of their audience. Their reputation as a powerful platform for discussion was destroyed. Karoline Leavitt, on the other hand, emerged from this story as a winner. She became more than just a conservative who managed to resist pressure. She became a symbol of the fact that one can be confident, resilient, and not afraid. And most importantly, she didn't run away. She stayed. And the whole world saw it.